Hello, everyone. My name is Sapira Mosenyan Rahman, and I serve as a program manager for the Mural Arts Institute. Thank you for logging on and joining us for a conversation between Jaskiran Dhillon and Anne Spice that we've titled Standing Rock, Decolonizing Creative Practice in the Environmental Justice Movement. Today feels like a recalibration in the right direction for climate justice, and we're lucky to have you all here for tonight's event. Before I introduce our speakers, I want to acknowledge that we're streaming this conversation from occupied Lenape land, and in the spirit of reparations, we're dropping a few links to a few local Indigenous tribes and organizations that you might want to consider contributing to. I also want to share that this program is presented by the Mural Arts Institute through the Arts and Environment Capacity Building Initiative and in partnership with the Environmental Justice Department of Mural Arts Philadelphia, whose director, Shari Hirsch, is here with us live for this event. Established in 2017 as an initiative of Mural Arts Philadelphia, the Institute's approach is centered around connection, advancing research on and development of socially engaged public art practices, and is in service to a larger movement that values equity, fairness, and progress across all of society. The Mural Arts Institute is supported by the JPB Foundation, the Kresge Foundation, and the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. Thank you. And now to introduce our speakers. Jaskiran Dhillon is an anti-colonial scholar and organizer who grew up on the Treaty 6 Cree territory in Saskatchewan, Canada. Her work has been published in The Guardian, The Nation, Cultural Anthropology, Feminist Formations, Environment and Society, Social Texts, and Decolonizing, amongst other venues. She's the author of Prairie Rising, Indigenous Youth Decolonization and the Politics of Intervention, and co-editor of Standing with Standing Rock, Voices from the No Double Movement. Jaskiran is an associate professor of global studies and anthropology at the New School in New York City. Anne Spice is a Tlingit member of the Kwanlin Dun First Nation, a queer, Indigenous feminist and anti-colonial organizer, acting assistant professor in the Department of Geography and Environmental Studies at Ryerson University, and an associate fellow with the Yellowhead Institute. Her work is in the tradition of feminist activist ethnography and supports Indigenous land defense against settler state and extractive industry invasion. She's been actively supporting the Indigenous land reoccupation on Wet'suwet'en territories since 2015, and her work dwells in the intersection of traditional land use, Indigenous geographies, histories of Indigenous resistance, poetry, and art. Her writing has been published in The Environment and Society, Jacobin, The New Inquiry, and Asparagus magazine. And so to kick things off, I wanted to explore the executive order issued yesterday on climate change that included stopping construction of the Keystone XL pipeline. This was a campaign promise that President Biden made, and tribes, Indigenous activists, landowners, and environmental groups applauded the immediate action. They also stressed that if he wants to follow through on meeting his bold climate goals, he must make the same moves to cancel the Dakota Access Pipeline and stop Line 3. And so, to our speakers, can you share your immediate reactions to the executive order and orient us towards those who have made this possible and the creative interventions they've utilized thus far?
All right, thank you so much for that introduction, and thanks for having us here. I wanted to start by also drawing some attention to one of the other executive orders that was signed to put a temporary moratorium on oil leases in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, which is affecting Indigenous people, the Gwich'in especially, who are in the northern part of the Canadian territory of the Yukon. And so it's a temporary protection, but definitely a step in the right direction. And when it comes to these two executive orders, I think it's really important to note that they were made possible through years and years of work on the ground. In the case of the Keystone XL pipeline, primarily the work of Lakota and Dakota peoples who have built a strong coalition of support for their sovereignty on that territory and also against the Keystone XL, and that movement was the precursor to what happened at Standing Rock, and a lot of the networks of support that were built made Standing Rock possible. And so I think this is the result of a lot of lobbying and also a lot of direct action that people have taken in order to make their disagreements with this project known. In Canada, especially in the province of Alberta, which is where the oil would travel from if the Keystone XL were built, there is an attempt to make this into an issue around ethical resource extraction. And so there's the way that the Canadian state and oil and gas producers on this side of the border tend to frame this is that that oil coming from the Alberta tar sands, despite its massive environmental impact on surrounding nations, Indigenous nations, that this is ethical oil in comparison to oil coming from the Middle East. And so I think one of the things to keep an eye on is to really push against that narrative that oil that is extracted at the expense of Indigenous health and sovereignty, that is extracted with this huge uptick in violence in the communities surrounding resource extraction projects, that this is not ethical oil. And so we have to resist that narrative, which I think we're going to hear more of as Albertan politicians and Canadian politicians more broadly express their disappointment with this move by Biden. I'll pass it to Jaskiran.
Thanks for that, Anne, and thank you, Sepide, for the introduction. And I just want to begin by thanking the organizers for inviting us to be here as part of this event and your series. I know there's a lot of work that goes into organizing these things, so I just want to acknowledge all the behind the scenes work that actually is required to put an event like this together. And I also wanted to share that I'm speaking to you today from my home in Philadelphia on Lenape land. So I think Anne did a really good job of mapping some of the complicated but maybe hopeful terrain against which these executive orders have emerged. You know, it's a little bit on the infuriating side to have people credit Joe Biden and the current Democratic administration with, granting these big changes around climate change. And as Anne said, this is the work of an immense amount of perseverance and determination that has been in place for a very, very, very long time. And that's been led by the Indigenous people of Turtle Island. And so I think we just want to, and also many, many emerging youth movements in the last decade that have actually really done the hard work and sacrifice of fighting against a fossil fuel economy that has devastated the world, not just here in the United States and in Canada, but all over the globe. So I think it's, I agree with Anne, it's a step in the right direction, but we have a very long road yet to travel. So with that, I think we'll merge into our conversation today. Anne and I are going to be sharing a few sort of thoughts on different topics. And before we get started, we thought it would be important for us to define a few terms that we might be using throughout our presentation today. And these terms can also be seen as anchors for the ways that we understand what environmental justice means within the context of Indigenous sovereignty and ongoing colonial state violence. So we're going to start with a couple of terms, and then we're going to move into more of a conversational dimension for today. Anne, is there anything I missed that you want to add before we get started?
No, I don't think so. Go ahead.
Okay, great. So the first term that we wanted to flag is the term settler colonialism. And I think this was already mentioned in the introduction to us as well. So you may hear both Anne and I refer to the United States as a settler colony. And when we say that, what we mean by this is that we position the United States, and I would also say Canada, since Anne is speaking from Toronto, we position the United States as an illegitimate country founded through Indigenous genocide, the seizure and dispossession of Indigenous homelands, and the displacement of Indigenous peoples from those lands African slavery, and ongoing forms of colonial violence that impact Indigenous, Black, and people of color across Turtle Island. Pass it to you, Anne.
Okay, so the second term that we just wanted to introduce, and I think we've both used it a couple of times already, is the concept of Indigenous sovereignty. And when we mention Indigenous sovereignty, we're talking about a form of sovereignty, of self-determination and political autonomy that pre-exists the imposition of settler state. And so the United States and Canada claim sovereignty based on the doctrine of discovery, which goes back to the conquest of these territories, and their imposition of forms of settler governance over inhabitants of Turtle Island. And so when we talk about Indigenous sovereignty, we're talking about the enduring forms of political governance and autonomy that Indigenous peoples held prior to conquest and continue to hold these traditions of governance. And so respecting Indigenous sovereignty means stepping beyond a framework that is about the conferring of rights by the settler state to Indigenous people. It's about recognizing and actually respecting the decision-making power of Indigenous peoples on our own territories.
Excuse me. We also wanted to highlight that colonial gender violence is central to the way that we understand environmental justice. And what this means is that we center the experiences of women, trans, two-spirit, and non-gender conforming peoples in movement building and the way we develop our analysis and advocacy efforts around environmental justice. And we know that colonial gender violence is a long-standing tool used by settler states like the United States to ensure Indigenous dispossession of their homelands and displacement and various forms of elimination tactics that are developed in order to be able to ensure access to those homelands. And this also requires, when you center colonial gender violence, it also requires that you expand the lens through which you understand what environmental injustice actually is too. And this expands our sort of purview to other issues that are also interconnected. So education, poverty, housing, policing, and criminalization all become part of the picture as soon as you center colonial gender violence in an analysis of environmental injustice.
And finally, we wanted to talk about environmental racism and environmental justice and how these terms are shaped and transformed by the inclusion of an Indigenous sovereignty framework. And so when we're talking about environmental racism, we're talking about the disproportionate burden that people of color and Indigenous people face when it comes to the toxic effects of racial capitalism and industrial expansion. We're also talking about and wanting to really prioritize and center the experience of Indigenous people as not only based in the accumulation of toxicity and contamination and the forms that environmental degradation can impact Indigenous health, but also in a severing of ties with the land and with our relations that's based on the original occupation of our territories. And so not only are Indigenous people bearing the brunt of environmental degradation, we're also dealing with the fact that our lands, after being stolen from us and occupied by a settler force, are used through resource extraction to subsidize the settler state. And so there's a continued burden as resources are pulled out of Indigenous territories. The toxic effects of those processes are felt by our nations, and we're also feeding into this perpetuation of a system that we know is killing the planet. And so the theft of land and the denial of Indigenous sovereignty is a key factor in the continuation of environmental decline and climate change. And so we really want to make that connection clear, that this is not only the sort of accumulation of toxic effects, but the fact that colonialism itself is an instance of environmental racism. and the sort of original environmental racism that we are experiencing, and our push for justice has to include an anti-colonial analysis, because we see the climate crisis as starting in 1492, back with the first footsteps of the colonizers in this hemisphere. So I think that sort of leads us into talking about our work. So maybe I'll get Jas to start about talking about how we've worked together and how we sort of enter this conversation.
Yeah. Sounds great. So just so you have a sense of kind of where we're coming from and how we relate to one another and know one another, Anne and I worked very closely as comrades starting back in 2016. We met in New York City when we were doing support work for the Standing Rock Sioux in their struggle against the Dakota Access Pipeline. And we're both founding members of the New York City Stands with Standing Rock Collective. And we had the opportunity to really organize a collective response in New York City across a range of different kinds of interventions and platforms to be able to support that struggle. So I had the privilege and honor of working with Anne on a syllabus project, organizing and speaking at teach-ins, going to protests, organizing supply drives, actually being at Standing Rock together. And then subsequently, we've done numerous I think political education kinds of interventions and worked on other projects together too. So we've sort of been side by side in this work for a number of years now. And so that's some of what we're bringing to you tonight, is that kind of long-standing connection and working relationship and political commitment.
And I also just wanted to mention that part of my entry point into this work was with the Wet'suwet'en Nation, and specifically the Unistoten people in so-called Northern British Columbia, Canada, where members of that nation have returned to their territory to reoccupy pieces of territory that are under threat by oil and gas expansion, and right now specifically are threatened by the Coastal GasLink pipeline, which is a fracked gas pipeline, which would bring fracked gas sort of through northern British Columbia to a coastal port. And so I started working with the Wet'suwet'en in 2015 and have spent the last 3 years out on the territory helping support that movement as they faced a number of court injunctions and subsequent police raids in order to sort of force access for this company onto Indigenous territories. And so that work has been ongoing for me and shaped the way that I approached my advocacy for Standing Rock in New York, and sort of how I ground myself in this struggle is through that frontline work out in Wet'suwet'en territory. Okay.
Hey.
We're gonna go move to questions. So I think Jas is the first one.
Yeah. So so when we were thinking about speaking to all of you today for this event, we were sort of considering what would be some of the most sort of the biggest highlights or the most important things that we would want to stress. And one of the things that came to mind for me that I'm going to pose a question to Anne about right now is why Indigenous leadership in the environmental justice movement matters so much in this specific historic moment.
Yeah, so I think everybody recognizes that we're at a critical juncture when it comes to the climate crisis, when it comes to these unfolding sets of crises that we seem to be encountering. There's a lot of push towards technological solutions. There's, I think, an overemphasis on the ability of our governments to enact change. And as we mentioned at the beginning of this, it is really sometimes disappointing and disempowering to see these tiny steps forward coming from settler governments, as heralded as like these sort of big, sweeping possible changes, when they're barely scratching the surface of what is necessary to reverse course if we're going to, save our existence on this planet. One of the reasons why Indigenous leadership is so important is because we carry generations and generations, thousands of years of knowledge when it comes to how to connect meaningfully and be in reciprocal relation with the lands, waters, air that we live in. And so when we think about how to reset and how to be in better relation that produces, effects that aren't so devastating, I think that Indigenous people are the natural leaders of the climate movement. And, we have this generational knowledge that's been stolen from us and that we've been, pulled away from. But turning back to think about what our responsibilities are on our territories, what our responsibilities are to the land and water and animals, and what our responsibilities are to future generations, invites us to really dig into the ways that we can create an alternative to this machine that's destroying the planet. And we can create that alternative, and it's easier for us to imagine it because we've lived it in recent history. And I think to return to the decision made to put a moratorium on drilling in the Arctic Wildlife Refuge, the Gwich'in people, Arctic people, many of them still get the majority of their meat from the caribou. So there are Indigenous peoples living within settler-occupied territories today who are still in the kind of reciprocal relationship with the land and water and animals, that they are primarily surviving from a system that exists outside of capitalist extraction. And so I think the fact that that is something that people have been able to hold on to and help to protect, that kind of way of life, gives us a deep knowledge of how to move forward in better relation with the environment. And so I think that it's really important to hold up Indigenous leadership in that way, so that we're able to share part of what we understand to be the best way to live in relation and steward the territories that we've lived in for thousands of years.
Yeah, and I just thank you so much for that. And I think I just to add to that, I think it's also, I'm not sure, how many people know that Indigenous peoples are currently protecting 80% of the world's biodiversity, right? And so, and their Indigenous-led environmental movements are some of the most fierce and confrontational movements on the planet right now. And so not only is there all of the, long-standing, deep intergenerational forms of knowledge and reciprocal relations and understandings about what it means to actually live in relation to human and other than human beings. It's also that this is where the leadership on the planet currently is actually happening, and that we have a responsibility to stand by our Indigenous comrades as they lead the struggle across the globe on these questions, and that this is actually not a new struggle. Right? So there's a whole set of tactics and strategies that are part of a long-standing perseverance and determination to protect homelands, and that from which we have a great deal to learn.
And just to maybe follow up on that as well, I think that part of Indigenous-led resistance is the crackdown, has resulted in a crackdown on Indigenous leaders in the environmental movement. And so the criminalization of Indigenous land defense and the way that Indigenous leaders specifically are targeted for violence and assassination and the sort of character attacks on Indigenous leadership show that we're a threat to the capitalist social order. And so the way that we can sort of see that reflection as we know that we're effective because of that, and that we hold a lot of potential strategies to help combat these really destructive mechanisms that are destroying our land and water. And I think that we see that, and we see that the threat is recognized when Indigenous leaders are targeted. And so I think that there's a holding up of Indigenous leadership that needs to happen. We need to recognize Indigenous leaders. And then we also need to really work to protect that work and to condemn the forces that are really pushing against this leadership and trying to undermine it as we move forward. The second question that we were thinking about and that comes to mind, and Jaskiran just sort of mentioned it in the end of her remarks, is that there are this like myriad of different strategies that Indigenous led water and land defense movements have used. So I'm wondering if you can just talk a little bit about what these different strategies are and sort of where you've seen them or deployed and how they sort of operate within a kind of environmental justice framework.
Yeah, thanks for the question. So one of the things that I feel like or one of the things that I think struck me most when I started, working alongside Indigenous communities that were engaged in land and water defense movements was the range of strategies that were employed in defense of their territories and waters. And you can tell that these are longstanding, that they have been honed over generations, and that they've been in existence for a really long time. And so, some of the things that I've witnessed are and learned about and seen sort of in action are an emphasis on political and historical education. So what does it mean to actually educate people about the history of the territory and the history of state violence that has been acted on that territory? I've seen Indigenous young people, this is from Standing Rock, organize a series of runs across the country to raise awareness. There are all kinds of ceremonies that have been conducted, which I wouldn't, want to speak to here, but that hold specific standing and meaning in specific communities. People have held all kinds of, teach-ins, and I've seen organizing around divestment campaigns. And of course, there are protests and occupations, as well as direct action and confrontation with the police and the military. So I think the comments that Anne just made recently about the importance of actually developing strategies to support and protect frontline Indigenous land and water defenders is especially crucial and important in this moment. And of course, there's also really powerful protest art, writing, and performance that is also part of the landscape of resistance strategies that I've seen enacted over time. And these are in multiple locations that I've seen this sort of play out. And I think what it demonstrates is that there is a tremendous amount of knowledge and political strategy and I think resistance sort of built into the way that these movements develop, because you're basically organizing on the basis of a very long history of resistance. And this is something that is not just newly emerged. I'm always struck by the incredible perseverance and determination in the face of so much state violence. It's actually staggering when you look at the kind of violence that's enacted against very small communities who are attempting to defend their land and water against corporatization and state intrusion, ongoing state intrusion, and seizure of the homelands, and there's so many examples I can think of. Anne mentioned the Wet'suwet'en struggle against the Coastal GasLink pipeline. There's the Algonquins of Barrier Lake, there's the Standing Rock Sioux, there's all the organizing that's going on right now around Line 3, and there are many, many more. The Shinnecock Nation is currently engaged in a struggle for their territory as well right now. So there's so many examples of this, and I think it's very clear that this is a place that we should be looking to for leadership, and that we should be standing by our Indigenous comrades. Again, I'll say that again in this moment.
I think just to add to that, there the part of the reason why a diversity of tactics and all these different strategies are necessary is because of the colonial genocide that has been attempted on Turtle Island that leaves Indigenous people in a minority on our own territories. And so it becomes necessary, not only for the sake of combating climate change and for advancing the environmental movement, but for our survival as Indigenous peoples, it becomes necessary to make sure that our struggles are known and made legible. And that can be a blessing and a curse for us. We require the support of people beyond Indigenous nations in order to advance our goals and to maintain access and use of our territories so that we're able to continue to live as Indigenous people freely on our territories. And so a lot of these strategies are about making sure that we're able to get the word out, that we're able to really push back against the way that the state tries to cast us as disruptive, as extremists, as terrorists even, for protecting the land and water. And so I think it's really important that we're able to kind of get that message out and that people are receiving it and also following along, not just by spreading it on social media, but by really putting their own bodies on the line and acting in support of Indigenous-led movements for land defense. And so one of the examples, recent examples of this was in response to a set of police raids that happened on Wet'suwet'en territory in early 2020. There was a call for solidarity and support, and people across the country and actually around the world led direct actions in support of the Wet'suwet'en and against the violence of the state, which came in to enforce this court injunction in order to allow this company to continue to build a pipeline without Indigenous consent. And so the fact that people not only supported that sort of in spirit, but actually put themselves on the line. They shut down railways, they shut down highways. There was a huge sort of outpouring of support that led to the paralysis of the Canadian economy for a period of time as a way to show that you can't advance a platform of reconciliation with Indigenous peoples. You can't claim to be in good relation with Indigenous peoples as a settler state if you want a project to go through and they say no, and you respond by sending like armed police with semi-automatic weapons and snipers into a territory to remove any opposition. Mm-hmm. So that response, I think, is really important to highlight that a lot of the different tactics are to get the word out, but then like we need people to hit the ground and move with that, and to actually continue that creativity around our response to push the issue forward. And I think that part of the reason we're seeing victories in the case of KXL and in the case of the Arctic Wildlife Refuge is because people have been creative about making sure that this goes beyond our individual nations. And then there has been a response. People have recognized that Indigenous people have something to say about what's happening in these places and the possible effects of continued resource extraction, and have actually acted on that knowledge. And I think that's also really crucial.
Yeah, you've actually begun the answer for the third question. So that's great. Seamless movement to the third question, which is actually about what it means to be in good relation to Indigenous-led movements for environmental justice. And, how do you think about what that kind of critical relationality is? And maybe, I don't know if you want to speak to that specifically, the critical relationality part, or you want to add anything else in?
Yeah, I think thinking about our relations is a really important way to reframe how we talk about environmental movements. And I think that it can sometimes get lost when we talk about protecting or defending our territories. It can get lost sometimes in the language of sovereignty, which makes it sound like we are sort of just holding on to something for ourselves. But one of the really important things to note is that when Indigenous people talk about our territories, we're talking about territories that we belong to, as opposed to a space that we consider owning as property. And so what we are protecting is not just this sort of like set of this piece of territory, this piece of land that we're going to set up barriers or blockades to keep people from accessing. What we're protecting is our right and our responsibility to continue to care for the relations that make us as Indigenous people and that feed us and have kept us alive. These are relations that are key to our survival. And in really concrete terms, for my nation, for the Tlingit people, the salmon are crucial to our existence as people. The salmon have continued to feed our existence, literally feed our existence for thousands of years. It's my responsibility then as a member of this nation in my relation to the salmon to help protect that being and their continued existence, because there's a reciprocity there. If I protect the salmon are going to feed us and continue to help us to exist and to survive. And so it's that relation that we're actually protecting and defending when we talk about land defense. Really what relationality does is it encourages people to think about what their responsibilities are and to maybe pick up a piece of the burden that we feel as Indigenous people. I feel deeply that it's my responsibility to sort of hold up those relations and to deepen those relations and to strengthen the connection between myself and the land. And I would love, and it would give me a lot of hope to see more people picking that up as a piece of their responsibility as people who are now occupying or settled on this territory.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I would just add to that as I think about this work, from this political work and this commitment for myself, I think also about the ways that my own story of the history of my family's immigration to Canada is also, is deeply connected and tied to the history of Indigenous dispossession and elimination, right? In order for Canada to exist as a country, a certain set of things, a number of forms of violence had to be enacted, have to continue to be enacted. So then what is my responsibility to that territory upon which I grew up? Like, how do I actually reframe how I understand what it means to live on that land? And that means actually critically thinking hard about what relations actually mean and what work is actually required in order to be able to uphold those in a good way. And that, I think, Anne did an incredible job of outlining the importance of, material action, actually thinking concretely about how that translates into everyday lived reality, and where the disproportionate burden falls on doing some of this work, and how we can leverage and draw on our own skills and knowledge and creative practice to be able to also carry some of that hard work forward. And that, the more that we understand our own relationship to this land, the more we understand our responsibility to it and to the responsibility to the peoples upon whose territory we actually reside. Do you want to add anything else, Anne, before we pass it over?
I don't think so. I think we can pass it back. I think there's some questions already formulated. There you are.
Thank you so much. I so appreciate witnessing that. And I'm struck by what you said, that the environmental justice movement started in 1492 as an accumulation of toxic effects on the planet and the earth and the people who live in it, but also colonization. So thank you for grounding us in that way and everything you've mentioned so far. I have a few questions to pose, and then to the audience, we will be responding to audience Q&A in a moment. But just thinking about the current time that we're in with COVID, and knowing the disproportionate impact on Indigenous communities and on tribal lands right now, we're seeing many elders lose their lives to the virus. And those elders are the language keepers, the medicine makers, the dressmakers. They are the artists and culture keepers in a very profound way. And if you can offer some commentary on what is being lost with this this swift generational loss, and what do you know that you can share with us that might offer a little bit of hope?
Yeah, well, I think that the pandemic really has had a huge effect on Native communities, and in places where Native communities have been able to reduce the effects, it is because of their ability to exercise Indigenous sovereignty.
Mhm.
So some of the northern communities were able early on to shut their borders, basically, to sort of traffic through. And in places where that was possible, they held off the effects of the pandemic for far longer than it was in other places. So, you know, the technology of the blockade and actually physically shutting off communities in order to help protect those knowledge keepers was a hugely important strategy in the early days of the pandemic. In places where that was not allowed, you know, we saw that definitely as like a you know, attempt at state violence, that not allowing people to protect their communities, you know, meant that they were at risk of losing our elders, who are, as you say, are the knowledge keepers and are especially holding a lot of our language. I know there's been attempts to shape health policy within Indigenous nations. I know the Navajo Nation and others have prioritized immunizations for language keepers, for people who have Indigenous languages as their first language. I think that's a really crucial thing. An important thing to think about is how our health policy and how our crisis response actually includes a survival response when it comes to our culture. I think that is something that not a lot of people are thinking about, but that's something really important. There, in the early days of the pandemic as well, there were, you know, there was a swift response from some of the like really well organized Indigenous nations like the Lummi, who were able to actually arrange support for people beyond their own Indigenous members. Healthcare support because of the way that they sort of had organized. And so I think that's an important thing to think about. Indigenous peoples have dealt with epidemics, pandemics, like all these diseases sweeping through our communities since the first steps of conquest. So we have experience with the devastation wrought by colonial disease. And we know that it's been used, and it has been used as a weapon to eliminate us in the past, intentionally and unintentionally. And so you know, when this pandemic started, there was a lot of fear in Indigenous communities that this could be mobilized to really hurt us, and because we've seen it before. And that may seem like a really pessimistic way to look at this. It's like, you know, a force that we can't control, but we've seen disease used and really weaponized in the service of Indigenous elimination. So that's something that, you know, was really scary to people. I think because of that, we also have survival strategies and are, you know, really attentive to the ways that our own knowledge of how this works can help protect us as we move through the pandemic. I think one of the things that's like really hopeful is the way that Indigenous people and others really turned to more self-reliant food practices. People started growing gardens. I think that there is an opening in the way that we talk about hunting and gathering practices as not just some archaic cultural practice on the part of Indigenous people, but as a survival strategy that works. That, you know, we're less afraid of the grocery store, you know, shutting down or not having what we need if we have a freezer full of moose. So I think that, you know, these are protecting protecting our access to territories for hunting and gathering protecting our knowledge of traditional medicines and plant medicines from our territories. All of that is helping us survive in this moment, and I think is also providing a good example of what it means to kind of extract ourselves from this web of dependence that we have on these industrial processes, on capitalist food provisioning. They're like, what would we do if we couldn't buy our food? It's like, we actually know exactly what we would do. And we can put energy into building back the skills we need to do that.
Thank you so much. I've witnessed what you've been describing in some work we're doing with Indigenous organizations around the country through the Mural Arts Institute. And it's just incredible, like requesting and taking land back from counties and growing food and teaching others to participate in this way, and how sustainable it can be now, in the past and in the future. So thank you for everything you mentioned, Anne. Just a few minutes before we go into audience Q&A, I just want to, I love the story in which you met and you started working together in solidarity spaces in New York City during Standing Rock, which was such an intense hub of solidarity for the movement. Specifically, these spaces were that of which Indigenous struggles are viewed in deep intersectional companionship with Black liberation, solidarity with global wage workers, the Free Palestine movement, and degentrification. Movements addressing settler colonialism can't be viewed in isolation, as you've already brought up, and we're witnessing the continued assault on all of these communities and movements, right, in 2021. So perhaps it feels more acute than ever, or maybe we're more hopeful than ever, but I'd love to know a little bit more about what you've learned from your work in these intersectional spaces that speak to the creative practice of future building.
So I can start, and I'll try to be brief because I know we need to move to audience Q&A quickly. So I would say that, one of the things that I feel like I've learned is that our worlds are co-constituted with the worlds of others, and that we may have our own specific struggles and stories that we live our lives in and through. We're deeply connected to others. So understanding how our struggles are connected to the struggles of others, to understand how those ways of being are actually co-constituted, actually tied to one another in very direct ways, is one of the most important things that I feel like I've taken away from my organizing and intellectual work over the last decade or so. I feel like I've also learned that one must act with humility and patience and care, which isn't always the sort of order of the day in the kind of colonial capitalist world that we live in. And that, that a sort of recentering of collective over individual is actually paramount in order to be able to do that. And to do those things and to be able to approach this work in that way, to sort of actually move towards the kind of relationality that Anne outlined for us. And I think we have to consistently remind ourselves what the stakes of these struggles are, and that we know that we can't be disconnected from struggles and fights that are happening in other parts of the globe. We know that there is deeply ecological dimensions. There are deeply ecological dimensions to imperialism, and environmental devastation must always be situated within an international context of expanding and growing US empire and imperial projects. We know the United States owns the deadliest and most funded military power in the world. So climate justice must also involve demilitarization and attention to those ongoing imperial projects. So it's really like that. If I had to say something quickly, that's what I would say.
Thank you so much, Jaskiran. We really appreciate it. Thank you both. Shari, I'd love to welcome you into this space. Folks, Shari is the director of the Environmental Justice Department at Mural Arts, and she's going to be handling audience Q&A. So thank you for hopping on, Shari.
Okay, so the first question is, could you talk about how the Indigenous cultures you are part of or engaged with consider artistic and creative practice, and if applicable, how those artistic practices are connected to land and water protection efforts.
So maybe I can start there. I think that our Indigenous cultures are foundationally creative. Our art is a part of who we are. It's also something that's been like extracted and exploited as extracted from its living space in the cultures that we occupy, on the lands that we occupy. So part of what we do in land and water struggles is to connect that creative practice back to the land and to its situation, and insist that actually it doesn't circulate without our political concerns. And I would argue that for a lot of us, our art, and I'm speaking specifically as a Tlingit person, Tlingit art, and especially formline, has been extracted from our communities, stolen and circulated in museums across the world. That can't happen without a consideration of how our politics are operating on the ground, and without a consideration of us as autonomous peoples. So that this also sort of comes through the ways that we use art and creative practice in land defense. And as I was saying before, I think this really comes down to how we get the message out about what's going on our territories. And that it's really important to make this visible and visual. We've been insisting that we should have sovereignty and autonomy on our territories since they were first conquered. And so I think we've had to be creative to try and continue to make that heard, and to really make ourselves understood when it comes to how we want to be engaging with the territories. The territories themselves, can be like incredibly beautiful spaces. And I think that like there's an aesthetics to clean land and water that is worth protecting. And a lot of the time we don't have to do a whole lot other than to just step back and be like, look at this. You really want to put a factory here. You really want to put a pipeline here. And the aesthetics of destruction are something that we can also use to really highlight what is going on and to make it visible to people. What does a clear cut look like? What does an oil spill look like? Mm-hmm. We can use that to really sort of show what the stakes are of our struggle, while also tuning into our creative practice to make that known. And I think that there's like all sorts of ways that artists have used like protest art and banner making and all sorts of other like creative ways to visualize what's happening on Indigenous territories. So I think that's there's lots of techniques out there to kind of get that out, but part of it is just really rooting our creative practice in our politics, and insisting that that's how it circulates.
So I hope we can squeeze in two more quick questions. Can you talk a little bit about Standing Rock? It was a major shift in the environmental justice movement, and certainly a radical change in the coalition of people who came together. And you talked a little bit about that earlier, that moving, how things are messaged to make a larger support. But can you talk about that in relation to local movements like in Philadelphia, and what we can learn from Standing Rock?
So is a question is a question about, so just to make sure that we understand exactly what you're asking about. So is a question about what do we learn, when can we learn? What does Standing Rock teach us about environmental justice?
Yes, in local movements, because earlier Anne spoke about, at a larger scale, and how to support across, like how broad the support was, and mentioned in particular around the recent thing that Anne was involved in, and I don't want to say it wrong, the wet sweat thing. So can you talk about what we learned from Standing Rock in local movements, like in Philadelphia, in environmental justice, very locally?
Yeah, I think that one of the things that is clear, and I'm sure Anne has more to add to this point, but I think when I first started learning about Standing Rock, the struggle against the Dakota Access Pipeline, you know, it took me a minute to realize that this was not the first time that there had been environmental devastation on the Missouri River. And so one of the things that I did was educate myself about the damming projects, all of the ways that the Missouri River had actually been impacted by the US government, by state governments, by corporations that were looking to expand industry, to build infrastructure. And so I would say that same lesson applies to any local context that's engaged in an environmental justice struggle. So if you're looking at the way particular plants get built in Philadelphia next to particular neighborhoods, there's a very long history that precedes the current struggle against any new plant or new industrial development project that's taking place. And so one of the things that I think is really important is that we, you know, in our colleague and comrade Nick Estes's, you know, book, Our History is the Future, demonstrates the incredible importance of this, right? That we understand the history that precedes the current struggle in order to understand what our best tactics might be, so that we're informed about the intergenerational forms of knowledge that are tied to that place, so we know who to talk to, so we know who to learn from, right? And that so we also know the kind of everyday reality on the ground that is often, you know, best articulated by the people that live it. So that's one of the things I would say.
Great. The next question is for Anne. You mentioned industrial processes. I'd like to hear more about Indigenous perspectives on how we should engage with this monolithic system that we rely upon, even as we recognize that these processes are destroying the planet.
I mean, I think that we can get overwhelmed really easily with our cultivated dependence on oil and gas, on these processes that we know are contributing to climate change. It can feel really difficult to extricate ourselves from the system. And it's in fact one of the sort of most common arguments made against Indigenous resistance is that, you know, people see us driving vehicles, see us using oil and gas. How can you claim to be against the system if you're using it? I think that part of this is what Jaskiran just pointed to, that we really have to understand that this dependence was cultivated through colonialism, that it was something that was a strategy, a technique to make sure that Indigenous peoples were unable to resist the imposition of settler governments. And so now we're in a situation where like we're all dependent on oil and gas, and you can't go cold turkey without a whole bunch of supports. You know, where do you live? Where do you live where you can cut yourself off the grid? On Indigenous territories in some places, right? So I think that it's about trying to find small ways to pull ourselves out of this network. I think part of it is creative work to actually realize this isn't the only way things could be. There's another way of doing things that is not only possible, that people have experience with, it's within our grasp to imagine ways of living beyond capitalism. We've done it, our ancestors have done it. And so I think that we can help sort of expand people's imaginations around what is possible. I think that happens too when we think about how to live within Indigenous legal orders, that when you think about what it would take to actually respect Indigenous law and governance enough to abide by it, it's a way of just kind of refocusing the way that we're stuck in this system, to start to imagine what an alternative might look like, and to actually move towards, by nurturing these relationships with Indigenous people and with the land and water, and putting energy into them, and really thinking about how we can make them more healthy, that we'll already automatically be sort of extracting ourselves from that web and moving towards something that is more healthy and contributes to our survival as humans.
It's 6:31. we're supposed to stop right now. There was like probably 4 questions about people who want more information, like how to learn more and how to connect more. They all had it in slightly different things, like museums to work with, ideas. Is there anything you want to say to folks who this really triggered their need to learn more? Do you want to throw out some quick advice to them?
Jaskiran, do you want to start?
Well, I think it would depend on exactly what it is that they're interested in
Settler colonialism, the role of nationalism and environmental justice,
yeah.
museums that are working with Indigenous folks.
So in terms of like the kind of political education work and the questions that are related to that, I would refer people to the Standing Rock Syllabus project, which I can post a link for, which has, which Anne and I worked on along with a number of other comrades in New York City to pull together, and then people all over the country actually that helped. But there are downloadable PDFs to 6 or 7 thematic sections. Nationalism comes up in a number of them, as do education and a number of history and sort of criminal justice and policing. And so that's a fantastic source. And not all of those articles speak specifically to Standing Rock. They're much broader than that. So it's an incredible free resource for being able to access information right away. And then in terms of like cultural institutions, and I don't know if there's specific ones that you wanted to highlight, that's a trickier landscape.
None of them deserve it, to be honest. There are people starting to think about how to do this work responsibly, but it's really baby steps at this point when it comes to museums in particular, and natural history museums are like a whole other world. They're like the worst of the worst.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that, they're moving towards it because of massive pressure on these institutions to view our cultural heritage as more than a collection of objects,
Mm-hmm.
and as living beings in a lot of cases that, I mean, in my view, I'm a bad person to ask about what museums I think are doing good work, because I just think we should abolish them all and they should give our stuff back, so that we're able to actually use them and to continue to learn how to survive as Indigenous peoples. So that's my perspective on that. When it comes to other resources, one of the things we didn't really touch on here, but I definitely want to highlight, is that there's a lot of overlap with Indigenous goals and the goals of the abolition movement.
Mm-hmm.
I think that people are doing some really exciting writing and thinking right now about how our histories are entwined, and how moving forward means doing this imagining, as I was saying before, around how we can make these systems, these carceral systems, the prison system, the capitalist system, how we can make them irrelevant by working with each other instead of turning to the state. And so there's the Abolition Journal, which has a couple of issues out, and many others who are thinking about this, especially across Black and Indigenous struggle.
I think we'll stop questions there. And it was interesting because you basically answered another question just now by what you said, and earlier too, which is about the mainstream and environmental movement, how frustrating it is that it just spins and it's all about trying to strive for regulation. And what you just stressed is like working together rather than looking to the government for resolution and interventions and success around these things, would just keep seeming to be superficial. So that was great that you answered that question on the side of that. So maybe Sepide, you're gonna close it up?
Just wanted to share with folks who are watching, I just dropped the links to what Jaskiran and Anne mentioned. If you are registered, if you registered through Eventbrite, we'll also send out an email with resources. And if you're tuning in from Facebook, we will drop these links into the Facebook Live kind of chat. box as well in the future for you to refer to. Just wanted to thank everyone who tuned in tonight. I want you to know that you can continue to watch it. It'll be on Facebook. So if you want to go back to some parts, if you find them informative, please feel free to do so. Please feel free to be in touch with any of us. We really appreciate your time. Jaskiran and Anne, I cannot thank you anymore. I thank you from the bottom of our hearts for being with us today. I think today, the day after the inauguration, was a really special day to have this conversation and to welcome you into this space. Shari, thank you so much. Our support at Mural Arts Philadelphia, many people made this event happen. So we thank you all and we wish you all a good night.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Good night.
Take care.